Mixed martial arts is the hardest sport to predict. My heart can't take these upsets and crazy turn of events that we've seen in these past couple of UFC events. In the last three major main UFC events, we've seen the underdog win in unbelievable and spectacular fashion. Firstly, at UFC 291, the slight plus 125 underdog Justin Gaethje not only wins, but KOs Dustin Poirier cold with a head kick out of nowhere in the second round. And I almost forgot in the event before, Dricus du Plessis, as a plus 270 underdog, opened up his nose and beat the dog shit out of Robert Whittaker, the longtime gatekeeper of the division and former champion. And then in the next event at UFC 292, the plus 210 underdog Sean O'Malley KOs Aljamain Sterling with a perfect right hand. Granted, I called it by the way, but still amazing and against the odds. Finally, the fight I've been dying to talk about, UFC 292 this past weekend. Sean Strickland shocks the world as he not only wins over Izzy as a plus 450 underdog, but drops and dominates Izzy arguably for every single round at his own game, outstriking Izzy and defending beautifully. So with these upsets and unpredictable moments in the highest level of MMA, I got to thinking, MMA might be the hardest sport to predict. So a couple things before I make my argument. One, I will be referencing mostly UFC fights, even though I said the sport of MMA as a whole is the hardest to predict. Even though the UFC isn't technically fully encapsulating the entire sport of MMA, I mean, come on. The UFC basically houses the best MMA talent in the world and in turn, the best and highest level fights. Also, the US courts can now agree that the UFC basically encapsulates the entire sport of MMA. Second, obviously this is my opinion, and being that I'm a huge combat sports fan, I will be biased towards MMA. Obviously, all sports are hard to predict. Unpredictability is literally what makes sports so fun to watch, and also why sports betting is a thing. Also, shout out DraftKings, use code TJLovesFight. So anyways, with those housekeeping items out of the way, here's why, in my opinion, MMA is the hardest sport to predict. Reason number one, the puncher's chance. There is no other sport besides fellow combat sport boxing that has a move that can just end the fight or the match entirely. The idea of the puncher's chance, like said before, came from boxing and basically means that no matter how good one fighter is compared to another fighter, that underdog of a fighter will always have that chance of catching the technically better fighter with one punch and winning the entire fight. But unlike boxing, MMA not only has a puncher's chance, but a kicker's chance, a kneer's chance, an elbower's chance, a triangler's chance, etc, etc, etc. There are so many different ways in which the fight can just end unpredictably, and the person heavily favored could just lose in literally only a couple of seconds, nullifying anything they did in prior rounds. And that chance of a fight just ending out of nowhere makes the sport so insanely hard to predict in comparison to other sports. So I'm also a pretty big basketball fan as well, and sometimes I imagine the sport having a knockout shot as well. Like imagine if making a full court shot just ended the game. Even if a team was up by 30 in the last minute of the game, if the other team scored with a full court shot, the game would simply end and that team won despite losing every other minute of the game. That's kind of what a puncher's chance feels like, and adding this aspect to any sport would make it 10 times more unpredictable. Which brings us into reason 2 as to why MMA is the hardest sport to predict, which is styles. To add on to the different ways a fight could end, there's just simply different ways the fight could play out. In boxing, they say styles make fights, meaning the type of fight you're going to get is dependent on the style matchup between two fighters. For example, there's the classic boxer versus puncher matchup that always makes for a great fight at the highest level. Will the boxer be able to outlast and outmaneuver the puncher, or will the puncher find their puncher's chance and take the boxer out? In the same vein, styles can turn theoretically competitive fights to one-sided beatdowns, as shown in the Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight. This is obviously true in MMA, a sport that encapsulates boxing, but what happens when you add kickboxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and everything in between? You have different stylistic matchups in each of those martial arts, and when combined, you now have matchups across these different sports, which exponentially increases the matchups you have to account for in total. Instead of boxer versus puncher, you now have kickboxer with tremendous boxing power and great takedown and submission defense versus a high-level wrestler with highly technical striking. The stylistic combinations are endless and so hard to predict. And what adds even more complexity is that at any moment, a fighter can break out of their style and just start doing things they've never done before. I mean, who would have thought that Francis Ngannou, who was also an underdog in this fight, would have chosen to out-wrestle Cyril Gane and won dominantly in that way, given that he was KOing literally everyone before that. Boxing, kickboxing, wrestling, and jiu-jitsu are hard enough to predict on their own, so combining these gives a whole nother level to unpredictability. Which brings us into reason number 3, MMA is relatively a new sport. The UFC is only 30 years old, and the sport of MMA in general, as in events under sanctioned rules, is maybe 10 years older than that. So with the sport being so young, it feels like there's a new meta change every single year and sometimes every single event, and what dominates in the sport evolves so quickly as well. That's not to say that other sports aren't still evolving, but given most major sports have existed for over half a century or even a century in some cases, these sports have had many years to see what works and doesn't work, making those sports a little more predictable. In MMA, the sport has changed so drastically over every single decade. Just 10 years ago, things like using calf kicks in mass to break down an opponent's mobility and same-side combos being used to knock people out by ending with a head kick weren't as popular or as meta as they are now. Then if you go 10 years before that, simply being a well-rounded martial artist was a rarity. A guy like GSP, who had great striking but equally a great ability to shoot takedowns and wrestle, was considered a unicorn-like fighter. Now with how the sport has evolved, fighters would get smashed and exposed if they're not well-rounded enough. Shit, just last week I didn't think the Philly shell was viable in MMA given that someone can just kick over the top of it, but Sean Strickland of all people proved that it could be used at the highest level if you literally keep walking forward and not give your opponent space to kick. With the frequency of meta changes in the UFC, you never know what new technique or strategy can be proven effective and when this could happen. And finally, another reason why MMA is so hard to predict is because of the relatively small sample size of performances at the highest level of MMA. Most of the top fighters in the UFC only have about 10 to 15 fights under the promotion. Of the top 10 pound-for-pound fighters, Charles Oliveira and John Jones are the only top fighters with more than 17 fights under the promotion, with Kamaru Usman coming close with exactly 17. But to put that in perspective, that's less than the 17 games played in the NFL season, which is an American sports season that is already known to have some of the fewest games, if not the fewest games in American sports. And you can definitely make the same case for boxing, as boxers only fight once or twice a year, and only a third or even a fourth of their total professional fights are fought at a high level. But if we take into account all professional fights of both UFC fighters and boxers, boxers usually have much more total fights than UFC fighters and thus a larger sample size. And as we know, a larger sample size yields a better prediction. If we think about this in a data science-y machine learning perspective, the more data we have in a training model, the better and more accurate the results. Predicting the performance of an NBA player that played 82 games is going to be much more accurate than predicting the performance of a fighter that has only fought 10 fights. It also seems like there's so much time and variability between these fights, and fighters could drastically change in that time frame. Who would have thought that in one fight, Dricus du Plessis would go from barely being top 5 in his division to beating the longtime gatekeeper of the division in a huge upset to having a solid chance at being the champ in the upcoming months, all from getting his nose getting unplugged between fights. So with that, those are my reasons for why MMA is the hardest sport to predict. Please, I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Is it the hardest sport to predict? Is there another sport that's really hard to predict? Let me know in the comments. And again, thank you guys for watching this video and always supporting. Peace.